Whispers carried on desert winds told of the widow's curse. Men who took work at the Callahan ranch never lasted, vanishing into the night or fleeing with terror in their eyes. The townsfolk of Bitter Creek crossed themselves when passing her property, where a lone figure could sometimes be seen standing on the porch at dusk, watching the horizon. Then came Shadow Horse, an Apache warrior with scars both visible and hidden, seeking only honest work and a quiet place to heal. Unlike the others, he saw past the rumors to the truth of her pain, a grief that mirrored his own. As the days stretched into weeks, something unexpected bloomed in that haunted place. But could love truly take root where only fear had grown before? What darkness still lurked in the shadows of the lonely woman's house? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The noon sun beat down on Bitter Creek with merciless intensity as Shadow Horse dismounted in front of the general store. His bay mare, dust-caked and weary, lowered her head to drink from the trough while he adjusted the small medicine pouch hanging from his neck. A leather sack containing sacred items that had kept him safe through battles both remembered and those he fought to forget. The settlement wasn't much. A dozen weathered buildings lining a single dirt street, the false fronts of the establishments reaching skyward like headstones. 3 men lounging outside the saloon straightened as he approached, their conversation dying mid-sentence. "Water for my horse," Shadow Horse said, his voice a low rumble from disuse. He placed 3 copper pennies on the counter, avoiding the storekeeper's wide-eyed stare. "You passing through?" the storekeeper asked, fingers hesitant to take the money. "Looking for work." The statement hung in the air. A woman gathering supplies nearby paused, then hurriedly finished her business and left, the bell above the door tinkling in her wake. "Ain't much here for your kind," one of the men from the saloon called, emboldened by distance. Shadow Horse didn't respond. 5 years as a scout for the U.S. Army had taught him when words mattered and when silence served better. The memories came anyway. Blood-soaked earth, the screams of his people, the commander's approving nod when he led them to the hidden camp. The weight of betrayal still sat heavy on his shoulders. "Heard the Callahan widow needs help," he said finally. The storekeeper's face paled. "That place is cursed, mister. 5 men in the past year, all gone. Some ran off in the night. 2 just disappeared." "Which, that's what she is," added another man who'd wandered over from the saloon. "Husband died strange. Son too. Now she's out there all alone, and any man fool enough to take work there regrets it." Shadow Horse gathered supplies methodically. Flour, coffee, bacon, ammunition for the Winchester rifle strapped to his saddle. The medicine pouch thumped gently against his chest as he moved, a reminder of his grandmother's last words. "Find your peace, or the war inside will never end." "I'll take the job," he said. The saloon owner, a barrel-chested man with a waxed mustache, approached with a predatory smile. "Tell you what, Chief, I'll bet you $5 in gold you won't last a week at the widow's place." Shadow Horse met his gaze steadily. "Not a gambling man. 10 says he runs before Sunday," someone called from the back. The saloon erupted in laughter. Shadow Horse loaded his supplies onto the mare, the familiar routine a comfort against the hostility surrounding him. He'd faced worse than small-town hatred. "Which way?" he asked the storekeeper. 5 miles west. Can't miss it, only place with cottonwoods." "But mister," the man leaned forward, lowering his voice, "they say at night you can hear her dead husband calling from the west pasture." Shadow Horse mounted his horse, adjusting the medicine pouch once more. The small bag contained all he had left of his people. A carved stone bear, an eagle feather, a pinch of sacred tobacco, and a scrap of his mother's wedding blanket. Small things that anchored him to a world that no longer existed. "Much obliged," he said, and turned his horse westward. The trail wound through sagebrush and scrub oak, the afternoon heat shimmering across the landscape. Shadow Horse settled into the rhythm of the ride, his thoughts drifting to what awaited him. He'd stopped believing in curses long ago, had seen too many explained by simple human cruelty or natural causes. Still, the townspeople's fear seemed genuine. As the sun began its descent, he topped a small rise and saw the ranch spread before him. A two-story farmhouse stood surrounded by neglected fields and broken fencing. The barn listed to one side, its red paint long since weathered to a dull pink. A small creek cut through the property, and along its banks stood a row of cottonwoods, their green leaves a startling contrast to the brown landscape. And there on the porch, watching his approach, stood a solitary figure in a dark dress, her hand shading her eyes against the setting sun. Even at this distance, Shadow Horse could see her straight-backed posture, the tension in her stance. Not a witch, he thought, just a woman alone in a hard country. He rode forward to meet his fate. Elizabeth Callahan didn't move as Shadow Horse approached the gate, her figure as still as the weathered fence posts that marked her property. A shotgun rested in the crook of her arm, not pointed at him, but ready. "State your business," she called when he was within earshot, her voice stronger than her slight frame suggested. "Heard you need help with the ranch," Shadow Horse replied, keeping his hands visible on the saddle horn. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and dust between them. Elizabeth was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 35, though grief had carved lines around her eyes and mouth that suggested more years. A silver chain disappeared beneath her high-collared dress, and when she shifted her weight, he glimpsed the outline of a ring hanging from it. "Who sent you?" Suspicion edged her words. "No one. They're all betting you won't last a week." It wasn't a question. Shadow Horse nodded once. "They are." Something that might have been amusement flickered across her face, there and gone like heat lightning. She studied him openly, taking in the military-issue trousers, the worn boots, the small medicine pouch, the scars visible on his forearms where his sleeves were rolled up against the heat. "Apache?" she asked. "Yes. Army Scout." He stiffened slightly. "Was." She nodded as if confirming something to herself, then unlatched the gate. "I can offer room, board, and $15 a month. Work sunup to sundown, Sundays off if you want them." Shadow Horse dismounted, leading his horse through the gate. Up close, the disrepair of the ranch was even more apparent. Fence posts leaned at odd angles, the barn door hung from one hinge, and weeds choked what once might have been a kitchen garden. "Come on, then," Elizabeth said, turning abruptly toward the house. "I'll show you what needs doing." He followed, noting the precise way she moved, like someone carrying something fragile and dangerous. As they passed the house, he caught the scent of lye soap and coffee. A rocking chair sat empty on the porch, a half-finished piece of knitting abandoned on its seat. "Barn needs the most work," she said, gesturing. "Roof leaks. North pasture fence is down in 3 places. Irrigation ditch to the west field is blocked." Inside the barn, dust motes danced in the shafts of light that penetrated the damaged roof. Elizabeth pointed out tools, explained where supplies were kept, her words efficient and impersonal. She spoke like someone who had learned about ranching from books rather than experience. Precise terminology but lacking the casual confidence of someone born to it. "You can sleep there," she said, pointing to a small bunkhouse set apart from the main house. Previous workers stayed there. Shadow Horse led his horse to the corral, removed the saddle, and began brushing the animal down. Elizabeth watched him, arms crossed. "You're not much for talking," she observed. "No. Good. I've had enough of men's empty words to last a lifetime." As she turned to go, Shadow Horse noticed a small carved symbol above the bunkhouse door. Not Apache, but something older. Similar markings edged the windows. "Those carvings," he said. "What are they?" Elizabeth paused, one hand on the doorframe. "My husband was interested in protection symbols. Old magic." Her fingers moved to the chain around her neck, touching the hidden ring. Fat lot of good they did him. She showed him through the main house next, pointing out rooms with clipped efficiency. Kitchen, pantry, sitting room, study. A narrow staircase led to the second floor. Upstairs is private, she said. You have no reason to go there. At the end of the hall stood a door unlike the others, heavier, with a sturdy lock. Elizabeth's steps quickened as they passed it, her shoulders tensing almost imperceptibly. "What's in there?" Shadow Horse asked. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, raw pain flickered across her face before the careful mask returned. "Nothing that concerns you," she said. "Supper's at 6 if you want it. Otherwise, stay out of the house after dark." She started to walk away, then turned back. "One more thing, the west pasture is off limits. For any reason. Break that rule and you leave immediately." "Understood." Shadow Horse nodded, watching as she returned to the house, back straight, steps measured. Not a witch as the townspeople claimed. Just a woman surrounded by invisible fences as broken as the physical ones that enclosed her land. He unpacked his few belongings in the bunkhouse, laid his medicine pouch on the small table, and got to work. Shadow Horse woke before dawn to find a piece of paper nailed to the bunkhouse door. By the first gray light, he made out the neat, precise handwriting. Rules for employment at Callahan Ranch. 1. No entry to main house after sundown. 2. West pasture is off limits at all times. 3. Never approach Mrs. Callahan from behind. 4. Payment in gold on the 1st of each month. 5. No visitors. 6. No liquor. 7. No questions about family matters. 8. Any unexplained incidents to be reported immediately. He traced his finger over the last line, wondering what constituted an unexplained incident. The paper was yellowed at the edges, used before for previous workers. Some rules had been crossed out, others added in different ink. Shadow Horse folded the paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket. Rules were familiar territory. The army had been nothing but rules, most designed to separate him from his heritage. Cut your hair. Speak English. Forget your gods. These rules at least asked nothing of his identity. Elizabeth appeared on the back porch as he crossed to the barn, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders against the morning chill. She acknowledged him with a brief nod. "Coffee in the kitchen when you want it," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. The day passed in honest labor. Shadow Horse repaired the barn door, replaced rotten boards in the hayloft, and began clearing irrigation ditches. The work felt good after months of aimless wandering, the rhythm of hammer and saw a welcome distraction from memories. At noon, Elizabeth brought sandwiches and cold tea to where he worked. She set the plate on a fence post without ceremony. "The roof next," she said, pointing to where shingles had blown free in some long-ago storm. "Materials in the shed." Shadow Horse nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "Previous workers," he said. "What happened to them?" Elizabeth's face closed like a shuttered window. "They weren't suited to the work. The townspeople say." "I know what they say," she cut him off. "Superstitious fools. This is just a ranch, Mr. Horse. Nothing more." As she walked away, Shadow Horse noticed how she kept the house between herself and the west pasture, never looking in that direction even when the wind carried the scent of wildflowers from that way. In the afternoon, he worked on the roof, the vantage point allowing him to observe Elizabeth as she moved about her chores. She tended a small vegetable garden, fed chickens, carried water. Ordinary tasks performed with extraordinary vigilance, her head lifting at every sound, eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Once, when she thought herself unobserved, she stood motionless beside the well, one hand pressed to her mouth, shoulders shaking silently. Shadow Horse looked away, recognizing private grief when he saw it. As dusk approached, he completed the day's work and washed at the outdoor pump. Elizabeth had left a plate of food on the porch, beef stew, biscuits, and canned peaches. Simple fare, but the first home-cooked meal he'd had in months. He ate on the bunkhouse steps, watching as lights appeared in the main house windows. Through thin curtains, he could see Elizabeth moving from room to room, checking doors and windows with ritualistic precision before climbing the stairs with a lamp in hand. Shadow Horse entered the bunkhouse, noting how the previous occupant had carved symbols into the window frames, crude imitations of the ones on the main house, but with an urgency suggested by deep, jagged cuts. On the wall beside the narrow bed, someone had scratched a single word, "Leave." He unpacked his few possessions. Spare clothes, a straight razor, the Winchester rifle, ammunition, a deck of playing cards worn smooth from use. Lastly, he placed his medicine pouch on the small table beside the bed, the familiar weight of the sacred objects a connection to all he had lost. Sleep came slowly, broken by unfamiliar sounds, the creak of the windmill, coyotes calling in the distance, and once, what might have been footsteps circling the bunkhouse. Shadow Horse lay still, hand on his knife, but whoever or whatever was outside didn't attempt to enter. Just before dawn, he rose to check the yard and found his carefully arranged tools now placed in a perfect circle outside the barn door. He stood motionless, studying the ground for footprints and finding none. Rule 8. Any unexplained incidents to be reported immediately. Shadow Horse returned the tools to the shed and said nothing. After a week of steady work, Shadow Horse rode into Bitter Creek for supplies. The list Elizabeth had given him was practical: nails, seed for planting, lamp oil, sugar. At the bottom, she'd written, "Something sweet for yourself," in smaller letters, as if embarrassed by the gesture. The general store fell silent as he entered. The storekeeper recovered quickly, his surprise at seeing Shadow Horse again evident in his raised eyebrows. "Well, I'll be," the man said, leaning on the counter. "You lasted longer than most." Shadow Horse placed Elizabeth's list on the counter without comment. As the storekeeper gathered the items, he pulled out a stack of yellowed newspapers from beneath the counter. "Thought you might want to know what you got yourself into," he said, pushing the Bitter Creek Gazette clippings toward Shadow Horse. "These tell the whole Callahan story." Shadow Horse glanced at the headlines: "Local Doctor's Mysterious Death. Second Disappearance at Callahan Ranch Raises Questions. Widow Refuses Sheriff's Investigation." "Not interested in gossip," Shadow Horse said, pushing the papers back. The storekeeper shrugged. "Suit yourself. But you ought to know. Dr. Callahan wasn't just any sawbones. Studied back east. Respected man. Then their boy died, and something in him changed. Started dabbling in things no God-fearing man should touch." Outside, 3 men from the saloon noticed Shadow Horse through the window and entered, the bell above the door announcing their arrival. The largest of them, a ruddy-faced ranch hand with a badly healed broken nose, planted himself directly in Shadow Horse's path. "Well, if it ain't the witch's new pet engine," he said, tobacco juice staining his beard. "What's she got you doing out there? Dancing naked under the moon? Cutting up chickens for spells?" Shadow Horse said nothing, continuing to gather supplies. The silence seemed to aggravate the man further. "Hey, I'm talking to you, Chief," he said, shoving Shadow Horse's shoulder. "You gone deaf?" Shadow Horse turned slowly. "Move aside." The man laughed, looking to his companions for approval. "Or what? You gonna scalp me?" The storekeeper tensed behind the counter. "Now, Hank, I don't want any trouble in my—" "No trouble," Shadow Horse said evenly. "Just finishing my business." As he reached for a sack of flour, Hank knocked it from his hands, sending white powder billowing across the floorboards. "Clumsy savage," Hank sneered. Shadow Horse's hand moved with practiced speed, seizing Hank's wrist and twisting it just enough to bring the larger man to his knees. The move was quick, efficient, military training showing through. "Apologize to the storekeeper for the mess," Shadow Horse said quietly. Hank's face purpled. but with his arm bent at an unnatural angle, he managed a strangled, "Sorry." Shadow Horse released him and returned to gathering supplies as if nothing had happened. The three men retreated, muttering threats. As Shadow Horse paid for the goods, the store's door opened again. This time it was the sheriff, a weathered man with intelligent eyes and a silver star pinned to his vest. "Heard there might be trouble," he said, surveying the scene. His gaze settled on Shadow Horse. "You're working for the Callahan widow." It wasn't a question, but Shadow Horse nodded. "Mind stepping outside a moment?" In the dusty street, the sheriff lit a cigar, offering one to Shadow Horse, who declined. "Those boys in there, they're just ignorant," the sheriff said. "But there's real concerns about that ranch. 2 men gone without a trace last year. Good men with no reason to run off." "Mrs. Callahan tell you they ran off?" The sheriff exhaled smoke. "She claims she paid them and they left. No one saw them after." He studied Shadow Horse carefully. "Nothing unusual happened out there? No strange noises? No incidents?" Shadow Horse thought of the tools arranged in a circle, the footsteps in the night, the warnings carved into the bunkhouse walls. "Nothing," he said. The sheriff nodded slowly. "Dr. Callahan died 5 years back. Accident in the west pasture," Mrs. Callahan said. But Doc Willis, who examined the body, he had questions. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that don't have good answers." The sheriff tapped ash from his cigar. "Just watch yourself out there." Before returning to the ranch, Shadow Horse visited a small shop at the end of the street that sold fabrics and notions. He purchased a carved wooden comb inlaid with mother of pearl. An extravagance, but something in him wanted to bring Elizabeth more than just the practical items on her list. As he rode out of town, he felt eyes following him, weighted with expectation of his failure or disappearance. The medicine pouch thumped against his chest with each step of his horse, a familiar rhythm like a second heartbeat. His grandmother would have said the spirits were trying to tell him something. Shadow Horse wasn't sure he believed anymore, but he listened anyway, alert to whatever message might be carried on the wind. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for breaking ground in the fallow north field. Shadow Horse led the old plow horse from the barn, speaking softly in Apache as the animal snorted and pawed the earth. The beast was skittish like everything else on the ranch, alert to unseen dangers. As he adjusted the harness, Elizabeth appeared with a canteen and a cloth-wrapped bundle. "There's food for midday," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "The ground will be hard. Hasn't been turned in 2 seasons." Shadow Horse nodded, noticing the dark circles beneath her eyes. "You sleep poorly," he observed. A flicker of surprise crossed her face at his directness. "This place has too many memories for restful nights." They walked together to the north field, their shadows stretching long in the morning light. Elizabeth's knowledge surprised him as she pointed out where the soil would be richest, which sections had grown wheat before, where beans might thrive. "Your husband taught you farming?" Shadow Horse asked. "No," she replied, a hint of pride entering her voice. "I grew up on a farm in Ohio. My father believed daughters should know as much as sons about working the land." Shadow Horse set to work, the rhythm of plowing familiar from childhood. The plow blade bit into earth that had lain untouched since Dr. Callahan's death, revealing dark soil beneath the sun-baked crust. In the 3rd furrow, something caught the blade, a flash of white against the dark earth. He stopped the horse and knelt to examine the find. An arrowhead, perfectly formed, made of pale stone unlike any he'd seen in this territory. Ancient work, not Apache, but perhaps ancestral Pueblo. He brushed it clean and held it up to the light. Elizabeth had been watching from the field's edge. She approached cautiously. "What did you find?" "Old hunting point," he said, offering it to her. "From before. Very old." She took it, turning it over in her fingers. "My husband collected these. said this whole valley was sacred to someone long ago. She handed it back. You should keep it. Maybe it will bring you better luck than the others had. The morning passed in steady labor, the field gradually transforming under his efforts. Occasionally, Shadow Horse glanced toward the house and caught Elizabeth watching him from the porch or through a window, her expression unreadable. At noon, he stopped to rest the horse and opened the bundle Elizabeth had prepared. Fresh bread, cheese, dried apples. Simple fare made with care. As he ate, she approached again, carrying a pitcher of water. I saw what you did in town, she said abruptly, pouring water into a cup and offering it to him. Shadow Horse looked up, questioning. Mrs. Peterson from the dry goods store told me about the incident with Hank Bowden, she clarified. Said you could have broken his arm but didn't. Shadow Horse shrugged. No need. And you bought me this. She touched the wooden comb now securing her hair, the mother of pearl catching sunlight. Why? The directness of the question caught him off guard. Seemed right, he said finally. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. I haven't had a gift since. She didn't finish the thought. Instead, she sat beside him on the edge of the newly plowed field, smoothing her skirts with a precise gesture. Do you have family waiting somewhere? She asked. Shadow Horse shook his head. All gone. The wars. Some. Sickness took more. Elizabeth nodded, understanding in her eyes. Is that why you work for a woman the town calls witch? Having nothing to lose makes one less afraid. Not afraid of ghosts, Shadow Horse said. Seen too many real monsters. There are no ghosts here, Elizabeth said firmly, but her eyes darted involuntarily toward the west pasture. Just memories. And yes, sometimes they make themselves known, but they're only memories. They sat in companionable silence until Elizabeth spoke again. Your name, Shadow Horse. Is that the name your mother gave you? No. Army name. White officers couldn't say my true name. And what is your true name? Shadow Horse studied her face, searching for mockery and finding none. Say-yo-ah, he said finally. Means wolf stands strong. Thank you, she said softly, for telling me. That night, Shadow Horse dreamed of voices whispering from the walls of the bunkhouse. He woke in darkness, heart pounding, to the sensation of being watched. The air felt heavy, charged like the moments before a storm. Outside, he heard footsteps circling the building, too light to be human. At dawn, he performed a cleansing ritual with sage and tobacco from his medicine pouch, moving sunwise around the bunkhouse. As the smoke curled upward, he noticed Elizabeth watching from her bedroom window, her expression a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been hope. 2 weeks passed with no further incidents. The ranch began to show signs of renewal under Shadow Horse's steady efforts. Repaired fences, a patched barn roof, cleared irrigation ditches. Each day, the tension in Elizabeth's shoulders eased a fraction more, her rare smiles lingering longer. But the west pasture remained forbidden, its tall grass undisturbed. Shadow Horse often felt its pull like a splinter under skin. Sometimes at dusk, he'd catch Elizabeth staring toward it, a statue carved from grief. One morning, unable to sleep past first light, Shadow Horse stepped outside the bunkhouse to find Elizabeth crossing the yard, her black dress stark against the pale dawn. She carried wildflowers clutched in one hand, her steps purposeful. Without conscious decision, he followed, keeping his distance as she approached the boundary of the west pasture. She passed through a gap in the fence and followed a faint path through knee-high grass. Shadow Horse hesitated at the fence line, recalling her firm rule. But something in her solitary figure, shoulders bent under invisible weight, pulled him forward. He stayed back far enough that his presence wouldn't intrude on whatever ritual she performed. The pasture was beautiful. Wildflowers nodded in the morning breeze. Cottonwood trees whispered along a small stream. Nothing suggested danger or darkness. Elizabeth stopped at a slight rise where a twisted juniper tree cast dappled shadows. She knelt beside something Shadow Horse couldn't see from his position. Her voice carried to him on the breeze, the words indistinct but the tone unmistakable, the soft cadence of someone speaking to a beloved child. Shadow Horse moved closer, careful to place each foot silently as he'd been taught. Now he could see what Elizabeth knelt before, a small wooden cross, weathered by seasons but well-tended. Beside it was a larger marker, a proper headstone bearing the name Thomas Callahan, M.D. As Elizabeth arranged fresh flowers at the base of the small cross, Shadow Horse's foot snapped a dry branch. She whirled, flowers scattering, her face transforming from grief to fury in an instant. "How dare you!" she cried, advancing on him with clenched fists. "This place is forbidden. I made that absolutely clear." Shadow Horse stood his ground, making no move to retreat or defend himself as she struck his chest with closed fists. The blows held little force, the fury behind them already dissolving into anguish. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "You had no right." Her voice broke. "No right to see this, to intrude on my privacy." "The graves," Shadow Horse said quietly. "Your husband and my son." The words seemed torn from her. "James. He was 4 when the fever took him. My husband couldn't. A doctor who couldn't save his own child." She pressed her hands to her face. "Thomas was never the same after. None of us were." Shadow Horse nodded, understanding flooding through him. "My wife and daughter died of smallpox brought by soldiers," he said, the words unfamiliar in his mouth after years of silence. "While I was scouting for those same soldiers." Elizabeth's hands lowered slowly, her eyes meeting his. For a moment, they stood connected by the symmetry of their losses, the shared geography of grief. "I visit them every morning," she said finally. "I tell James about the birds I've seen, the flowers blooming, silly things." Her voice strengthened. "This is why the pasture is forbidden. These are my ghosts, Mr. Horse. Mine alone." "Shadow," he corrected gently. "Just Shadow." A small nod acknowledged the offered intimacy. Elizabeth knelt again, gathering the scattered flowers. Shadow Horse moved to help, but she shook her head. "Please go," she said, not unkindly. "This time is for them." He respected her wish, turning back toward the house. As he reached the fence line, her voice stopped him. "Shadow? The men who disappeared. They didn't respect boundaries. They came here, disturbed things, took relics from the graves. I sent them away, but the townspeople wouldn't believe that." "And your husband's death?" he asked. The sheriff mentioned questions. Pain flashed across her face. "Another time, perhaps." That evening at supper, which they now took together on the porch, Elizabeth spoke little. But when Shadow Horse rose to leave, she caught his sleeve. "My husband believed James's spirit remained," she said. "He tried methods to communicate with him. Dangerous methods." She released his sleeve, fingers lingering a moment too long. "I don't believe as he did, but sometimes I feel James near." "Is that madness?" "No," Shadow Horse said. "Not madness. Just love." In the soft glow of the porch lantern, their shadows merged on the weathered boards beneath their feet. Shadow Horse woke to the sound of breaking glass. He rolled from his bunk in one fluid motion, knife in hand, listening. The night was moonless, clouds obscuring stars, leaving the ranch in perfect darkness. Another sound, a thud against the main house's back door. Not the wind, not an animal. He moved silently, barefoot across the packed earth yard. The Winchester would have been better, but there wasn't time to load it. At the edge of the house, he paused, letting his eyes adjust to the deeper shadows. A figure moved on the back porch, trying the door handle. Shadow Horse circled behind, using skills-honed tracking for the army. When he was 3 feet away, he spoke. "Move and you die." The figure startled, dropping something that shattered on the porch boards. A lantern, its glass chimney breaking and oil spreading in a dark puddle. Shadow Horse seized the intruder by the collar, spinning him against the wall. It was a young man, perhaps 20, with the smell of cheap whiskey on his breath. "Don't kill me," he gasped. "Please don't kill me." Light spilled from the house as Elizabeth opened the door, a shotgun in her hands. She wore a hastily donned robe, her hair loose around her shoulders. "Bobby Turner," she said, recognizing the intruder. "What are you doing on my property?" The young man's eyes darted between them. "Just a prank, Mrs. Callahan. The boys at the saloon said." "Said what?" she demanded. "Said your engine wouldn't last the month. That the house would get him like it got the others." His words tumbled out. "Said if I came and left a warning, it might speed things along." Shadow Horse released him but kept the knife visible. "What kind of warning?" Bobby pointed to the broken lantern. "Was gonna leave it lit on the porch. With a note." Elizabeth's hands tightened on the shotgun. "A burning lantern. On my wooden porch. In this wind." Her voice was dangerously calm. "Do you know what would have happened if that oil had ignited?" The young man paled. "It wasn't supposed to. We didn't think." "Get off my land," Elizabeth said. "And tell Hank Bowden and his friends that the next person who trespasses gets buckshot, not conversation." After Bobby had stumbled away into the darkness, Elizabeth sagged against the doorframe, the shotgun's barrel lowering toward the floor. Shadow Horse gently took the weapon from her trembling hands. "Not ghosts," he said. "Just men. This time." She rubbed her arms against the night chill. "But there have been other incidents. Things I can't explain so easily." They inspected the broken lantern together. Shadow Horse found a scrap of paper among the glass, the warning Bobby had mentioned. Crude letters spelled out, "Witch's engine next to die." "Charming," Elizabeth said, her voice steady again. "Shall I get a broom for this mess? Or would you prefer to run screaming into the night like my previous employees?" The attempt at humor surprised him. "Broom," he said. "Running uses too much energy." A small smile touched her lips. "Well then, I'll fetch it." As Shadow Horse cleared away the broken glass, he studied the yard and surrounding areas. The ranch was vulnerable, too isolated for help to arrive quickly if real trouble came. Elizabeth returned with the broom and a cloth to soak up the spilled oil. "This isn't the first threat," Shadow Horse observed. "Not a question." Elizabeth sighed. "No. The banker in town, Whitmore, wants this land. The creek that runs through the west pasture is the only reliable water source for miles in drought years." She worked methodically, her movements precise even in the dim light. "After Thomas died, Whitmore offered to buy the ranch for a pittance. When I refused, the accident started. Cattle found dead. Fences cut." "Why stay?" Shadow Horse asked. "Easier to sell, start fresh elsewhere." Elizabeth's hands stilled. "Because my family is here," she said softly. "In that pasture. I won't abandon them." When the porch was clean, they stood awkwardly in the pool of light from the open door. Elizabeth pulled her robe tighter, suddenly conscious of her state of undress. "Thank you," she said, "for your quick response." Shadow Horse nodded. "I'll check the property. Make sure no one else is hiding." "Be careful," she said, her hand briefly touching his arm. The contact was fleeting but electric, sending unexpected warmth through him. For a moment, neither moved. Then Elizabeth stepped back into the doorway. "Good night, Shadow," she said softly before closing the door. Shadow Horse completed a thorough patrol of the property's perimeter, finding no other intruders. But as he returned to the bunkhouse, he noticed something he'd missed earlier: fresh footprints beneath Elizabeth's bedroom window, different from Bobby Turner's boots. Someone else had been watching the house. He stood motionless in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon him. Saturday brought clear skies and the monthly market day in Bitter Creek. Elizabeth emerged from the house wearing her best dress, navy blue with small white flowers, high-necked but more fitted than her everyday attire. She'd arranged her hair differently, pinned up with the wooden comb Shadow Horse had given her. "I need to sell eggs and buy supplies," she announced as Shadow Horse repaired a chicken coop. "You needn't come." Shadow Horse glanced at the wagon she'd prepared, already hitched but missing several boards from its side. "Wagon won't make it," he said. "Wheels cracked too." Elizabeth frowned, examining the wheel. "I hadn't noticed. I suppose I could ride." "I'll come," Shadow Horse said, already moving to saddle the horses. "Wagon needs replacing anyway." Half an hour later, they rode side by side toward town, Elizabeth on her aging mare, Shadow Horse on his bay. The morning sun cast long shadows across the trail, and meadowlarks called from fence posts along the way. "People will talk," Elizabeth said suddenly, "about us arriving together." Shadow Horse gave her a sidelong glance. "People already talk." A small smile touched her lips. "True enough." After a pause, she added, "I was respected once, you know, when Thomas was alive. I hosted the Ladies' Aid Society, taught Sunday school." The smile faded. "Amazing how quickly that changes when tragedy strikes. And when you refuse to sell your land," Shadow Horse added. Elizabeth nodded. "That most of all." The transformation was immediate as they entered town. Greetings died on lips as people noticed them. Conversations hushed, then resumed in whispers. Shadow Horse had expected the reaction for himself. He'd experienced similar all his life, but the open hostility toward Elizabeth surprised him. The market occupied the town square, with farmers and merchants setting up stalls around a central gazebo. Elizabeth directed her horse to a spot near the edge, nodding stiffly to those who couldn't avoid acknowledging her. "Mrs. Peterson will take the eggs," she told Shadow Horse, handing him a basket. "I need to speak with Mr. Findlay about the bank note." As Elizabeth dismounted, Shadow Horse noticed the silver hair comb he'd purchased in his last visit to town. He'd left it on her porch one evening without comment, and seeing it securing her carefully arranged hair stirred something unexpected in his chest. He delivered the eggs to Mrs. Peterson's dry goods stall, where the woman's initial wariness gave way to curiosity. "She looks better," Mrs. Peterson said, counting out payment. "Less haunted. You must be good for her." Shadow Horse pocketed the coins without response. "She wasn't always so isolated," the woman continued, lowering her voice. "Elizabeth Callahan came from good family in Ohio, educated, could have married anyone. Then she chose Thomas, and everything changed after they lost little James." Across the square, Elizabeth stood rigid before a portly man in an expensive suit, Whitmore, the banker. Though too distant to hear their words, Shadow Horse could read the confrontation in their postures. He moved toward them, instinctively protective. "Final notice, Mrs. Callahan," Whitmore was saying as Shadow Horse approached. "The bank cannot extend further credit on sentimentality alone." "The terms were clear," Elizabeth replied, her voice level despite the color in her cheeks. "Payment due quarterly, which I've met without fail." Whitmore's gaze shifted to Shadow Horse, his expression souring. "I see you've replaced your workforce with unusual help." "Mr. Horse is my employee, yes," Elizabeth said. "And as he can attest, the ranch is being restored to working order." "One savage can't save a failing enterprise," Whitmore said dismissively. "Be reasonable, Elizabeth. My offer stands. A fair price for the water rights alone would settle your debts and leave something to start fresh elsewhere." Shadow Horse remained silent, recognizing that his intervention would only undermine Elizabeth's position. Instead, he stood slightly behind her, a solid presence at her back. Elizabeth straightened to her full height. "The ranch is not for sale, Mr. Whitmore, Expect my payment as scheduled." She turned away, effectively dismissing him. As they moved through the market gathering supplies, Shadow Horse noticed how Elizabeth held herself, chin high, shoulders back, ignoring the whispers that followed them. It reminded him of warriors facing impossible odds with dignity. "Thank you," she said quietly as they completed their purchases, "for not interfering with Whitmore. Most men would have tried to speak for me." "Not your keeper," Shadow Horse replied. "Just your employee." Something flickered in her eyes. Disappointment? Yes, of course. On the ride home, Elizabeth was unusually quiet. As they crested the final hill overlooking the ranch, she reined her horse to a stop, gazing at the land spread before them. The repaired barn, the freshly plowed fields, the house standing proud against the backdrop of mountains. "It looks different now," she said. "Almost like it did when we first came here." Full of hope. Shadow Horse followed her gaze. "Good land. Strong house. Strong woman too," Elizabeth added, a rare moment of self-assertion. When she turned to him, the setting sun caught the silver in her hair comb, sending prisms of light dancing across her face. For the first time since he'd known her, Elizabeth Callahan smiled fully, without reservation or shadow. Something shifted between them in that moment, delicate as a butterfly's landing, profound as an oath. The storm arrived without warning a week later. One moment, Shadow Horse was mending fence in the east pasture under clear skies. The next, a dark wall of clouds rolled over the mountains, bringing the scent of rain and ozone. Elizabeth appeared at the edge of the field, skirts billowing in the rising wind. "Storm coming," she called. "A bad one." They worked quickly to prepare, securing loose items, moving livestock to shelter, boarding windows. The wind strengthened as they worked, bending the cottonwoods along the creek, sending debris tumbling across the yard. "Like this in '68, Elizabeth shouted over the wind as they struggled to close the barn doors. Took the roof clean off. The first fat drops of rain struck as they ran for the house, the sky now bruise dark overhead. They barely made it inside before the downpour began in earnest, rain lashing the windows like buckshot. "You'll have to stay here," Elizabeth said, lighting lamps against the premature darkness. "Too dangerous to reach the bunkhouse now." Shadow Horse stood dripping on the entryway rug, suddenly aware that in a month of employment, he'd never been inside the main house after sundown, one of Elizabeth's firm rules, now broken by necessity. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the parlor in stark white. Thunder followed immediately, the house trembling with its force. "Fire," Elizabeth said, moving to the hearth. Her practiced hands laid kindling and struck a match. "You should get out of those wet clothes. I have some of Thomas's things that might fit." While she searched upstairs, Shadow Horse took in the parlor. Faded but quality furniture, bookshelves lining one wall, a piano in the corner covered with a cloth. A doctor's home, reflecting educated tastes. On the mantelpiece stood a daguerreotype in a silver frame, Elizabeth younger and smiling, a handsome man with a serious expression beside her, a small boy, with his mother's eyes perched on his father's knee. "The Callahans," Elizabeth said, returning with folded clothing. She changed as well into a simpler dress, her hair released from its pins and falling in damp waves past her shoulders. Before everything changed, Shadow Horse changed in the kitchen, emerging in Thomas Callahan's clothes, trousers a bit short but serviceable, a white shirt that strained slightly across his broader shoulders. Elizabeth had made coffee, its rich aroma filling the kitchen. "The roof," she said as another lightning strike illuminated the room. They both looked up at the sound of water dripping somewhere upstairs. "I'll check," Shadow Horse said. They found the leak in the upstairs hallway, water streaming through a damaged section of ceiling. Shadow Horse examined it while Elizabeth held a lamp. "Flashing pulled loose," he said. "Can't fix until storm passes. Need to move things before water damages them." The nearest room was clearly Elizabeth's bedroom, simply furnished with a four-poster bed, a dressing table, a rocking chair by the window. She hesitated at the threshold, then nodded. "We can put the chest in here," she said. "It's Thomas's medical books and journals. I couldn't bear to lose them." Together they moved the heavy oak chest from the leaking hallway into her room. As they set it down, another flash of lightning revealed an old family Bible on her bedside table. "We should check the other rooms," Elizabeth said, avoiding his gaze. As the storm raged outside, they worked methodically through the house, placing buckets under minor leaks, moving precious items to safety. When they finished, they returned to the parlor where the fire cast dancing shadows on the walls. "Thank you," Elizabeth said, sinking into an armchair. "I couldn't have managed alone." Shadow Horse sat opposite her, the crackling fire between them. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, rain drumming against the roof, wind howling around corners. "Does this happen often?" he asked. "The leaks. More each year," she admitted. "I do what repairs I can, but—" She shrugged, a gesture of frustration and resignation. "I can fix it," Shadow Horse said, "when weather clears." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "You've already done more than I hired you for. Not just an employee anymore," he said simply. Her eyes met his across the fire. "No," she agreed softly. "I suppose not." The storm had trapped them in unexpected intimacy. With the usual boundaries suspended, Elizabeth seemed to shed some of her careful reserve. She made a simple meal of bread and soup, and afterward, surprising them both, she uncovered the piano and played. A gentle, melancholy tune that spoke of formal training long neglected. "Thomas loved music," she said, fingers resting on the keys. "He would read medical journals while I played. Said it helped him think." Her hands moved again, finding another melody. "He was brilliant. Graduated top of his class at Harvard Medical School. Could have practiced anywhere, but wanted to help where doctors were scarce." "The West Pasture," Shadow Horse said quietly. "How did he die?" Elizabeth's hands stilled. She closed the piano carefully. "An accident. Or so I told everyone." She stared into the fire. "After James died, Thomas became obsessed with the idea that he could still reach him. He studied spiritualism, ancient practices, anything that offered hope of contacting the dead." Rain lashed the windows as Elizabeth continued, her voice distant. "That last night he said he'd found a way, a ritual from some old book. I begged him not to try it, but—" She shook her head. "I found him in the West Pasture at dawn. The official cause was heart failure, but his expression—" "Fear," Shadow Horse supplied. Elizabeth nodded. "Pure terror, frozen on his face." She hugged herself, as if suddenly cold despite the fire. "Whatever he contacted in the darkness, it wasn't our son." The storm passed, but left its mark on Shadow Horse. 3 days after helping repair the roof in drenching rain, he woke drenched in sweat, his body alternating between burning heat and bone-deep chills. He managed to feed the livestock, moving as if underwater, before Elizabeth found him leaning heavily against the corral fence. "You're ill?" she said, pressing a cool hand to his forehead. "Fever. High one." Shadow Horse tried to straighten. "Work to finish." "The work can wait," Elizabeth said firmly. "You can't." He had no memory of the walk back to the bunkhouse, only disconnected images. Elizabeth's concerned face, the ground tilting strangely beneath his feet, the sudden softness of his bunk. Fever dreams took him then. Back to battles he'd fought, comrades lost, his wife's face as the sickness claimed her. He surfaced briefly to find Elizabeth bent over him, her lips moving in silent concentration as she pressed a cool cloth to his forehead. The bunkhouse table had been transformed into a makeshift pharmacy. Bottles and jars arranged in precise rows, herbs bundled and hanging from the rafters, a mortar and pestle crusted with some pungent mixture. "Drink," she urged, lifting his head to help him sip from a cup. The liquid was bitter but brought momentary clarity. "You have medicines," he managed. Elizabeth nodded. "Thomas taught me. Before that, my grandmother was a healer in Ohio." She adjusted the blankets around him with practiced efficiency. "Rest now." Darkness claimed him again. In his delirium, Shadow Horse confessed secrets long buried. The names of Apache camps he'd revealed to army officers, the faces of warriors who fell because of his betrayal, the crushing guilt that had driven him westward after his discharge. Words poured from him in a mixture of English and Apache, a poison long festering finally released. Through it all, Elizabeth's presence remained constant, changing compresses, administering tinctures, murmuring reassurances. Once, he woke to find her asleep in the chair beside his bed. Her head nodded forward in exhaustion, hair tumbling loose around her shoulders. Even in his fever, he recognized the trust implicit in her vulnerable position. On the third night, the fever broke. Shadow Horse woke clear-headed to find Elizabeth grinding herbs by lamplight, dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting she'd barely slept. "Water," he croaked. She looked up sharply, relief washing over her features. Setting aside her work, she brought a cup to his lips. "Your fever broke an hour ago," she said. "I was beginning to worry we might need the doctor from Carson City." Shadow Horse drank deeply, the cool water soothing his parched throat. "You're a doctor," he said. A small smile touched her lips. "Not officially, but I assisted Thomas for years." She hesitated. "You spoke a great deal. During the fever." Shadow Horse closed his eyes briefly, remembering fragments of his delirious confessions. "Army Scout," he said, "led them to my own people." "You were caught between worlds," Elizabeth said, "with impossible choices." "Still chose wrong," he replied. Elizabeth's hand found his, her touch cool against his skin. "We all have regrets that haunt us, Shadow. The question is whether we let them define us." He looked at their joined hands, her pale fingers against his darker skin, the incongruity somehow right. "Why help me? Just an employee. Is that what you think?" Elizabeth asked, her voice soft. "After all this time?" Before he could answer, she withdrew her hand and began gathering her medicines. "You should rest more. The fever's broken, but your body needs time to recover." Shadow Horse watched her methodical movements, noting how she handled each bottle and herb with knowledge born of long practice. Not just a doctor's wife, but a healer in her own right. "My wife," he said suddenly. "When sickness came, I was away, scouting. By the time I returned, the familiar ache rose in his chest, duller now with time but never absent." Elizabeth stilled, her back to him. "My son died while I was tending another family's children through the same fever," she said. "I've wondered ever since if I could have saved him had I been home." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That's the true curse of this place, Shadow. Not ghosts or spirits or angry townspeople. Just guilt. Mine, Thomas's, and now perhaps yours too." "Not yours," Shadow Horse said with sudden conviction. "Not your fault." "Nor yours," she countered gently. They regarded each other in the lamplight, two broken people recognizing their shared wounds. Elizabeth moved to the door, pausing with her hand on the latch. "It's nearly dawn," she said. "I should return to the house before anyone from town passes by and sees me leaving the bunkhouse. People would talk." "Let them," Shadow Horse said. Something shifted in Elizabeth's expression. Surprise, followed by the ghost of a smile. "Perhaps," she said, "but not today. Rest now. I'll bring food when you wake." As the door closed behind her, Shadow Horse realized that somewhere during his illness, a barrier had fallen between them. He'd shown her his deepest shame, and she had not turned away. Instead of judgment, she had offered understanding. Instead of distance, closeness. He touched the empty space where her hand had held his, feeling the lingering warmth like a promise. A week after the fever broke, Shadow Horse woke to screams from the main house. He was on his feet instantly, knife in hand, running barefoot across the moonlit yard. The screams had stopped by the time he reached the porch, replaced by quieter sounds of distress. He knocked sharply. "Elizabeth!" The door opened almost immediately. Elizabeth stood trembling in her nightgown, a shawl hastily wrapped around her shoulders, her face pale and drawn. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Just a nightmare. I didn't mean to wake you." Shadow Horse studied her carefully. "Not just a nightmare." She looked away, clutching the shawl tighter. "No, not just a nightmare." He waited, offering silence as a space for her words. Finally, Elizabeth stepped back from the doorway. "Would you come in? I don't think I can be alone just now." In the kitchen, she lit a lamp with shaking hands and put water on to boil. Shadow Horse sat at the table, watching as she moved about the familiar routine of making tea, her actions precise despite her trembling fingers. "It's always the same dream," she said finally, setting a steaming cup before him. "James calling for me from the locked room. When I open the door, it's not my son I find, but," she shuddered, "something wearing his face." Shadow Horse wrapped his hands around the warm cup. "The locked room upstairs." Elizabeth nodded. "It was his bedroom. After he died, Thomas couldn't bear to change anything. Said it needed to stay exactly as James left it, so his spirit would feel welcome." She stared into her tea. "I haven't been inside in over a year." The house creaked around them, old timbers settling in the cool night air. Outside, an owl called once, its voice carrying across the silent ranch. "Show me," Shadow Horse said quietly. Elizabeth's eyes widened. "Now? Spirit's strongest at night," he said. "If something's there, better to face it than run." After a long moment, Elizabeth nodded. "Wait here." She returned with a large iron key, its surface darkened with age. "I locked it after Thomas died. Couldn't bear to see it, couldn't bear to change it." They climbed the stairs together, floorboards protesting beneath their weight. At the end of the hall stood the heavy door Shadow Horse had noticed during his first tour of the house. Elizabeth hesitated before it, key clutched tightly in her fist. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. Shadow Horse gently covered her hand with his. Together, the key turned with difficulty, the lock mechanism grinding after long disuse. The door swung inward on protesting hinges, releasing the scent of closed rooms and faded memories. Elizabeth held the lamp high, its light spilling across a perfectly preserved child's bedroom. A small bed with a patchwork quilt, shelves of toys and books, a rocking horse in one corner, its paint faded but still bright. Everything layered with dust but otherwise untouched, as if the child had just stepped out and might return at any moment. Elizabeth moved into the room like someone approaching an altar, reverent and afraid. She touched the rocking horse gently, setting it in motion. "James loved this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thomas made it for his 4th birthday, the last birthday he had." Shadow Horse remained in the doorway, recognizing sacred space. "Good craftsmanship," he said, honoring the father's work. "He was a good father," Elizabeth said, moving to the small bed. "Patient, kind. He read to James every night." She picked up a book from the bedside table, dust rising in clouds. Even when he was exhausted from treating patients all day, Shadow Horse watched her move through the room, touching objects, recalling memories. She seemed both lighter and heavier with each step, burdened by grief yet somehow relieved to be facing it directly. "After the fever took James," she continued, "Thomas changed, started researching ways to communicate with the dead. At first, I thought it was just grief, his way of coping." She shook her head. Then he began experimenting. Seances, rituals from obscure texts, things no Christian should touch. She returned to the rocking horse, setting it in gentle motion again. I lost them both that year. James to fever, Thomas to obsession. Shadow Horse stepped into the room then, feeling the weight of its preserved memories. My daughter, he said, the words coming with difficulty, was called Little Bird. She laughed at everything. Even when food was scarce, she found joy. Elizabeth looked up at him, understanding. In her eyes, how do you bear it? Apache believe the dead walk beside us, he said. Not ghosts, just presence. Memory carried in blood. Thomas believed he could bring James back, Elizabeth said, or at least speak to him again. He claimed to hear his voice from this room sometimes. Claimed the rocking horse moved on its own. Shadow Horse watched the wooden horse slow to stillness. What do you believe? I believe my husband destroyed himself chasing shadows, she replied, and nearly destroyed me too. She moved to stand before Shadow Horse, close enough that he could see the golden flecks in her green eyes. Until you came, she added softly. Something pulled between them, a current strong as the creek in spring flood. Shadow Horse reached out slowly, giving her time to retreat, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. Elizabeth leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. I thought I would die of grief, she whispered. Sometimes I still think I might. No, Shadow Horse said with quiet certainty. Too strong. When her eyes opened again, they held a question. Shadow Horse answered by drawing her gently into his arms. Elizabeth came willingly, her body fitting against his as if designed for that purpose. He held her carefully, feeling the tremors that ran through her slender frame. Neither spoke, neither needed to. In the stillness of the locked room, surrounded by memories of those they had lost, they found something unexpected. The possibility of beginning again. Morning found them sitting on the porch steps, watching the sun crest the eastern hills. Neither had slept after leaving James's room, but exhaustion had given way to a strange, peaceful clarity. Elizabeth had made coffee, and they shared it in companionable silence as the ranch awakened around them. I need to show you something else, Elizabeth said finally. She disappeared into the house, returning with a leather-bound journal, its pages dog-eared and stuffed with loose papers. Thomas's medical journal. But in the last year it became something else entirely. Shadow Horse accepted the book, feeling its weight, both physical and symbolic. Sure you want me to see? Elizabeth nodded. I think you need to understand what happened here, what might still be happening. The journal began as expected, patient notes, treatment records, supply inventories. Dr. Callahan's handwriting was precise, his observations detailed and scientific. But around the middle, the tone shifted. Entries became shorter, more fragmented. Medical observations gave way to references to obscure texts. Egyptians believed, native practices suggest, medieval accounts claim. After James's death, recorded in a single stark line, James Thomas Callahan, age 4, died 3:17 a.m. Fever. Failed. The journal transformed completely. Diagrams of circles with strange symbols. Lists of ingredients for unknown purposes. Passages copied from books with titles like Communing Beyond the Veil and Ancient Rites of Spirit Contact. The final entries were almost illegible, written in a shaky hand. June 15th, heard James laughing in his room tonight. Elizabeth says I imagined it. I know what I heard. June 18th, the rocking horse was moving when I entered the room. No windows open. No explanation. June 20th, made contact using the mirror method. Brief but certain. His voice, asking for help. June 23rd, Elizabeth found my ritual materials. Argument. She doesn't understand this is scientific. Death is just another state of being. Consciousness continues. I can prove it. June 28th, we'll try the final ritual tonight. Ancient, powerful, dangerous perhaps, but I cannot stop now. So close to bringing him back, even if only to say goodbye properly. Elizabeth refuses to participate. Must do this alone. The final entry, dated June 29th, contained just 3 words. God help me. Shadow Horse closed the journal, feeling unclean. He died that night. Elizabeth nodded, staring out at the west pasture where her husband was buried. I found him at dawn. There was a circle drawn in the dirt around him. Symbols I didn't recognize. Candles. And other things. She shuddered. His face shadow. His eyes were open, fixed on something I couldn't see. His mouth. She pressed her fingers to her lips, frozen in a scream. Shadow Horse set the journal aside. You believe he succeeded. I believe he contacted something, Elizabeth said. But not our son. The ranch lay peaceful in the morning light. Chickens scratching in the yard. A gentle breeze stirring the cottonwoods. Nothing suggested darkness or danger. Yet Shadow Horse had felt it from his first night in the bunkhouse. A presence, a watchfulness. The men who disappeared, he said. They found this journal? Elizabeth nodded. One of them, at least. Walter Jenkins. He was asking questions about Thomas's death, snooping through the house while I was in town. When I confronted him, he said he was going to try one of the rituals himself, for the adventure of it. Her voice hardened. I fired him immediately, paid him what he was owed, and watched him ride away. The sheriff didn't believe me, but I swear that's the truth. And the other man? Mitchell Parker. He. Elizabeth hesitated. He made advances. When I rejected him, he became angry, threatening. Said a woman alone had no right to this land. He disappeared after I caught him trying to enter my bedroom one night. I assume he left in shame, but I can't prove it. Shadow Horse believed her. Elizabeth Callahan might harbor secrets, but her directness, the steady way she met his gaze, spoke of honesty. There's more, she said quietly. Since Thomas died, I've experienced things. Objects moving, whispers in empty rooms, cold spots that appear and disappear. She looked down at her hands. Sometimes I think I'm going mad. Other times, I'm certain something remains here, something Thomas called up that night. Not madness, Shadow Horse said. Elizabeth's eyes found his, desperate for understanding. You believe me? Yes. Relief washed over her face. She moved closer, her shoulder touching his on the narrow step. What Thomas did, it violated something sacred, crossed boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. Her hand found Shadow Horse's, fingers interlacing with his. I need to make it right, but I don't know how. I know ways, Shadow Horse said. Apache rituals for disturbed spirits, for cleansing places where death came wrong. Hope flickered in Elizabeth's eyes. Would you help me? Yes, he said, tightening his grip on her hand. Elizabeth leaned forward then, her free hand coming up to touch his face. The kiss, when it came, was tentative at first, a question more than a demand. Shadow Horse answered by drawing her closer, his arm encircling her waist. When they broke apart, Elizabeth's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with something other than fear for the first time since he'd known her. I never thought I'd feel this again, she whispered against his shoulder. The letter arrived with the weekly mail delivery. Official stationery from First Territorial Bank of Bitter Creek, the envelope thick with legal documents. Elizabeth's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal at the kitchen table. Shadow Horse watched her face pale as she read. Bad news. Final notice of foreclosure, she said, voice steady despite her bloodless lips. 3 weeks to pay the note in full or forfeit the property. She passed him the documents. Though Shadow Horse's reading was limited, taught by army officers who considered literacy a way to civilize savages. He understood enough. The amount due was substantial, far more than the ranch could produce in 3 weeks. At the bottom, Whitmore's signature sprawled like a declaration of victory. "This can't be right," Elizabeth said, sorting through additional papers. The terms were quarterly payments for 5 years. "We're only in the 3rd year." Shadow Horse examined the fine print. "Says here, terms can change if property falls into significant disrepair or disuse. Of course it fell into disrepair. My husband died, and I've been struggling to keep it going alone." Elizabeth slapped the table in frustration. "This is just Whitmore's latest attempt to force me out." "The creek," Shadow Horse said. "That's what he wants?" Elizabeth nodded. "It never runs dry, even in drought years. The water rights alone are worth a fortune in this country." She gathered the papers, her movements precise despite her anger. "I need to check our records." Thomas kept everything organized in his study. The study was a small room off the main parlor, lined with bookshelves and dominated by a heavy oak desk. Elizabeth unlocked a drawer and withdrew a metal box containing financial records. Together, they spread the documents across the desk, piecing together the ranch's financial history. "Here," Elizabeth said finally, holding up a paper. "The original loan agreement signed by both Thomas and Whitmore. Quarterly payments for 5 years, then reassessment of terms." She scanned further. Nothing about accelerated payment for disrepair. "He changed the agreement," Shadow Horse said, "or replaced it entirely." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "Thomas always said Whitmore was a snake, but I never imagined he'd forge documents." She sat heavily in the desk chair, the fight suddenly draining from her. "Even if we can prove the forgery, it's his bank, his influence. My word against his." Her voice dropped. "I can't lose this place, Shadow. Not just for me, but for James and Thomas. Their graves are here. My life is here. Our—" She stopped, color rising in her cheeks. "Our future," Shadow Horse finished quietly. Their eyes met across the desk, the word future hanging between them. Fragile, new, yet somehow solid. 3 days had passed since their first kiss on the porch steps, days filled with tentative touches, lingering glances, and a growing certainty that neither had anticipated but both now embraced. A sharp crack from outside broke the moment. They moved to the window together, peering out to see 3 riders approaching. The banker Whitmore himself, flanked by 2 men Shadow Horse recognized from town, including Hank, the troublemaker from the general store. "What now?" Elizabeth muttered, straightening her shoulders. "Stay here. Let me handle this." Shadow Horse caught her arm. Together, they met the riders on the porch, standing shoulder to shoulder. Whitmore's surprise at seeing Shadow Horse beside Elizabeth was poorly concealed. "Mrs. Callahan," Whitmore said, tipping his hat without dismounting. "I assume you received the bank's notice?" "I received a fraudulent document," Elizabeth replied coldly. "One that contradicts our original agreement." Whitmore's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "The terms were quite clear about property maintenance requirements. Perhaps you should have consulted an attorney before signing." "My husband was an educated man," Elizabeth said. "He would never have agreed to such terms." "Your husband is dead, madam, and you are in default." Whitmore gestured to the ranch. "Look at this place. Half the fields untended, fences broken, buildings in disrepair. The bank has every right to protect its investment." Shadow Horse felt Elizabeth tense beside him but remained silent. He recognized the tactic. Whitmore was trying to provoke an emotional response that would make Elizabeth appear irrational, unstable. "Improvements being made," Shadow Horse said evenly. "Fields planted, buildings repaired." Whitmore's gaze shifted to him, cold with disdain. "Ah yes, your hired help. One man cannot save this enterprise, Mrs. Callahan. Be reasonable. Accept my offer. A fair price for the water rights, enough to settle your debts and start fresh elsewhere. The ranch is not for sale, Elizabeth said, and we will contest this foreclosure. We? Whitmore's eyebrows rose. My dear lady, has your isolation driven you to inappropriate attachments? What would your late husband think of you consorting with a— Careful, Shadow Horse interrupted, his voice low but carrying clear warning. Tension crackled between them. The two men flanking Whitmore shifted in their saddles, hands drifting toward holstered weapons. Shadow Horse remained perfectly still, but his stance subtly changed, balanced, ready. Elizabeth broke the standoff. You have no authority here today, Mr. Whitmore. If you wish to discuss bank matters, my attorney in Carson City will be available. Until then, you're trespassing. Whitmore's face flushed with anger. This isn't over, Mrs. Callahan. 3 weeks. He wheeled his horse, but paused to add, and I'd check your irrigation system. I hear there've been problems with dams breaking upstream. Terrible shame if your crops were to fail right when you need the income most. The 3 men rode away, leaving dust hanging in the air and the unmistakable weight of a threat behind them. That damned creek, Elizabeth said, watching them go. It all comes back to the water. Shadow Horse was already moving toward the barn. Need to check the irrigation channels. Now. They found the sabotage just in time. A crude dam of rocks and branches where the creek entered the irrigation channels, designed to burst with the next rainfall and flood the newly planted fields. Shadow Horse dismantled it while Elizabeth stood guard with the shotgun, both aware that Whitmore's men might still be watching. That night, as they sat by the kitchen fire, Shadow Horse said what they'd both been thinking. Need to deal with both threats. Elizabeth looked up from mending a shirt. His shirt, though neither commented on the intimacy of the gesture. Whitmore and the other. Shadow Horse nodded. For Whitmore, need proof of document tampering. For the other, he hesitated. Need ceremony. To help disturbed spirits find peace. Elizabeth's hands stilled. You mentioned Apache rituals before. For cleansing places where death came wrong. Yes, not complicated, but must be done right. He met her eyes across the firelight. Must be willing to let go. Understanding passed between them. Let go of James. And Thomas. Not forget, Shadow Horse clarified. Just release. Allow to journey onward. Elizabeth resumed her sewing, needle flashing in the firelight. Thomas would say this is all superstition. He was a man of science until, she sighed, until science failed to save our son. Science and spirit not enemies, Shadow Horse said. Both paths to truth. They spent the next day preparing. Shadow Horse gathered special herbs from the hills beyond the ranch, sage, sweetgrass, cedar. Elizabeth, overcoming initial hesitation, contributed items from Thomas's abandoned ritual supplies. Candles, a silver bowl, small crystals she couldn't name but felt drawn to include. In the afternoon, Shadow Horse disappeared into the hills alone. He returned at sunset carrying an eagle feather, its significance evident in the reverent way he handled it. From a fallen eagle, he explained as Elizabeth examined it. Found already dead. Spirit offering. They waited for full darkness before beginning. By unspoken agreement, they chose the west pasture for the ceremony, near the graves but not directly upon them. Shadow Horse constructed a small fire pit, arranging stones in a circle pattern. Elizabeth brought items from James's room. A small wooden toy, a lock of hair preserved in a locket, a favorite book. Are you sure about this? Shadow Horse asked as she placed them carefully beside the unlit fire. Elizabeth nodded, her face resolute in the twilight. If something Thomas did is keeping something here, then we need to undo it. The night was clear, stars appearing one by one in the deepening blue. Shadow Horse began by smudging them both with burning sage, the fragrant smoke curling around them as he murmured words in Apache. Though Elizabeth couldn't understand the language, the intent was clear: cleansing, protection. He instructed Elizabeth to sit opposite him across the unlit fire pit, the graves visible in her peripheral vision. Between them lay the items from James's room, Thomas's journal, and the eagle feather. Apache believed death is journey, Shadow Horse explained, his voice taking on a formal cadence. Sometimes, spirits linger when journey interrupted, by grief that holds too tight, by unfinished business, by wrong death. He lit the fire, its light casting their faces in gold and shadow. This ceremony not to banish, not to forget, just to release bonds that keep spirits earthbound. Elizabeth found herself trembling, not from fear but from the enormity of what they were attempting. Shadow Horse reached across the space between them, taking her hands in his. "Speak to them," he instructed gently. "Tell them what is in your heart." Elizabeth closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the fire, the strength of Shadow Horse's hands, the weight of years of grief. When she spoke, her voice was steady. "James, my beautiful boy, not a day passes that I don't miss you." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she continued. "I've held on so tight to the memory of you, perhaps too tight. If that's kept you from peace, then I release you now. With all my love." She took a shuddering breath before continuing. "Thomas, my husband, you were a good man before grief twisted you. What you did that night, what you sought, it was wrong. But I understand why you did it. I forgive you, and I release you." Shadow Horse added herbs to the fire, creating fragrant smoke that rose in a column toward the star-filled sky. He began a low chant, the eagle feather held in one hand while maintaining his grip on Elizabeth with the other. The night around them seemed to deepen, the ordinary sounds of crickets and night birds falling silent. The fire burned with unusual intensity, flames reaching higher than the small amount of fuel should allow. Elizabeth felt a pressure in the air, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. Shadow Horse nodded, his eyes reflecting firelight. "They hear us." A breeze arose from nowhere, circling the fire, stirring Elizabeth's hair. The flames bent, not randomly but with purpose, reaching toward the items from James's room before curling back. For a moment, just a moment, Elizabeth thought she heard a child's laughter carried on the wind. Shadow Horse's grip tightened on her hands. "Stay present," he murmured. "Almost done." He raised the eagle feather, moving it through the smoke in precise patterns while continuing his chant. The breeze intensified, swirling around them, lifting sparks from the fire in a spiral toward the stars. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the wind died. The fire returned to normal, crackling softly in the night. The pressure in the air dissipated, leaving behind an extraordinary sense of peace. Elizabeth felt it immediately, a lightness, as if a burden she'd carried so long she'd forgotten its weight had finally been lifted. Tears flowed freely now, but they were different tears, cleansing, healing. "They've gone?" she asked softly. Shadow Horse placed the eagle feather gently atop the items from James's room. "Not gone, just free. No longer bound to this place by pain or anger." He rose, helping Elizabeth to her feet. They stood close in the firelight, the ceremony creating an intimacy beyond physical touch. "Thank you," Elizabeth whispered, leaning her forehead against his chest. Shadow Horse's arms encircled her, strong and sure. Against her hair he murmured, "Your strength did this, not mine." Their embrace deepened, comfort transforming into something more urgent. When their lips met, it was with the intensity of people who had faced death and chosen life, who had confronted the past and now turned toward the future. Later, they would remember the West Pasture not as a place of grief and loss, but as the place where healing truly began. The night of the ceremony changed everything. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the ranch lifted, replaced by a palpable sense of peace. Elizabeth slept through the night for the first time in years, undisturbed by nightmares. Shadow Horse moved his few possessions from the bunkhouse to the main house without discussion, the transition as natural as the changing of seasons. For 5 days, they worked side by side in a newfound harmony, tending crops, mending fences, making the ranch productive again. In the evenings, they shared meals and conversation, discovering the quiet joy of simple companionship. At night, they found solace and passion in each other's arms, healing old wounds with gentle touches and whispered words. But Whitmore's deadline loomed. Together they formulated a plan. Elizabeth would travel to Carson City to consult an attorney while Shadow Horse remained to protect the ranch. They would leave at first light. The attack came in the hour before dawn, when night was at its darkest. Shadow Horse woke instantly at the sound of approaching horses, too many, moving too quickly for innocent purposes. He shook Elizabeth awake, pressing a finger to her lips. "Riders coming," he whispered. "Get dressed. Take the shotgun. Hide in the root cellar." Elizabeth grabbed his arm as he rose. "Together," she insisted. "We face this together. No time to argue." Shadow Horse nodded, reaching for his clothes and the cavalry knife he kept beneath the pillow, a relic of his army days, its blade still sharp enough to shave with. They dressed quickly in the darkness, moving with practiced efficiency. From the window, they counted 6 riders approaching the house, torches in hand. Even in the dim light, Shadow Horse recognized Hank's bulky silhouette leading the group. "Fire!" Elizabeth breathed, watching the torches. "They mean to burn us out." Shadow Horse's mind raced through military calculations. 6 against 2. Attackers armed and mounted, darkness providing both cover and confusion. Not good odds, but he'd faced worse. "Kitchen door," he said. "When they dismount, you take the shotgun. Stay behind me." Elizabeth nodded, face pale but determined in the faint light. She checked the shotgun's load with practiced hands, another skill her husband had taught her. They slipped downstairs as the riders circled the house, voices carrying through the night. "Spread out," Hank ordered. 2 to the barn, 2 round back. "Set the fires high. We want this place burning before that savage knows what's happening." Shadow Horse touched Elizabeth's shoulder, directing her to a position behind the kitchen door where she'd have a clear shot if anyone entered. He took position beside the window, knife ready. The first attacker appeared at the back door, torch held high as he tried the handle. Shadow Horse struck with military precision, one hand covering the man's mouth, the other bringing the knife hilt down hard at the base of his skull. The man crumpled without a sound, torch extinguished as it fell. A shout from the barn signaled the discovery that the bunkhouse was empty. Confusion spread among the attackers, their plan already unraveling. "They ain't in the bunkhouse," someone called. "Check the house," Hank shouted back. The kitchen door burst open as 2 men rushed in, guns drawn. Elizabeth fired without hesitation. The shotguns roared deafening in the confined space. The first man went down clutching his leg. The second froze, allowing Shadow Horse to disarm him with a swift kick. Outside, horses whinnied in panic at the gunshot. Shadow Horse pulled Elizabeth behind the heavy oak table as bullets splintered the doorframe, fired blindly from outside. "Cover me," he whispered, then darted toward the wounded man's dropped revolver. Elizabeth fired the shotgun's second barrel through the window, forcing the outside attackers to seek cover. Shadow Horse seized the revolver, checking its load before firing twice toward the muzzle flashes outside. A cry of pain told him at least one shot had found its mark. The night erupted into chaos. Shouting men, frightened horses, the crack of gunfire. Shadow Horse used the confusion to his advantage, years of military training taking over as he moved from window to window, firing at different angles to create the illusion of multiple defenders. "They've got help!" someone shouted. "There's more of them than we thought." "Fall back," Hank's voice commanded. "Get to the horses." Shadow Horse saw their chance. "Stay here," he told Elizabeth, then slipped out the side door, using the darkness and his knowledge of the yard to circle behind the retreating attackers. Hank was the last to mount, cursing as he struggled with his panicked horse. Shadow Horse struck from behind, dragging him from the saddle with an arm locked around his throat. "Call them back," Shadow Horse demanded, knife pressed to Hank's ribs. "Go to hell, Injun," Hank spat. The knife pressed deeper, drawing blood. "Call them back." Self-preservation won out. "Boys, hold up," Hank shouted, voice strained against the arm at his throat. The remaining riders hesitated, turning back to see their leader captured. In the torchlight, Shadow Horse recognized the foreman from Whitmore's ranch among them. "Tell Whitmore," Shadow Horse called clearly. "The Callahan ranch is protected now. Let him go, savage," the foreman demanded, raising his pistol. The shotgun boomed again. Elizabeth had reloaded and joined the confrontation, the barrel aimed squarely at the foreman. "The next one who calls him savage gets buckshot in his gut," she said, voice steady with cold fury. "Now drop your weapons and leave our property." "Our property." The words hung in the night air, a declaration more powerful than gunfire. Dawn was breaking as the attackers retreated, dragging their wounded with them, leaving Hank bound to a fence post for the sheriff to collect. Elizabeth's arm bore a shallow graze from a stray bullet, which Shadow Horse cleaned and bandaged with gentle hands. "You fought well," he said, tying off the bandage. Elizabeth's fingers intertwined with his. "We fought well," she corrected. "Together." The sheriff arrived mid-morning, summoned by a neighbor who'd heard the gunfire. He took statements and collected evidence with methodical care, his weathered face betraying little as Hank confessed to being hired by Whitmore's foreman. "Got enough to question Whitmore," the sheriff concluded, securing Hank in his wagon. "Maybe not enough to arrest him yet." "We need to end this," Elizabeth said after the sheriff departed. "Now. Today." Shadow Horse nodded, understanding her resolve. Together, they rode into Bitter Creek side by side, drawing stairs as they passed down the main street. Elizabeth wore her best dress, hair neatly arranged with the silver comb. Shadow Horse had donned a clean white shirt and black vest that had belonged to Thomas. Not a perfect fit, but dignified. The First Territorial Bank occupied the most impressive building in town, its false front rising a full story higher than its neighbors, windows gleaming with real glass. Elizabeth paused before the entrance, squaring her shoulders. "Ready?" Shadow Horse asked. "Yes," she replied, and pushed open the heavy oak door. Inside, polished wood and brass fixtures spoke of prosperity built on the struggles of ranchers and miners. A young clerk looked up, his welcoming smile faltering as he recognized them. "Mrs. Callahan," he stammered. "And, sir, how may I assist you?" "We're here to see Mr. Whitmore," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying through the quiet bank. "Immediately. I'm afraid he's in a meeting and cannot." "It concerns the attempted arson of my property last night," Elizabeth interrupted, "and his foreman's arrest for the same." The clerk paled. "One moment, please," as he disappeared through a door marked "Private." Other customers began whispering, word of the attack spreading rapidly. Shadow Horse remained a step behind Elizabeth, watchful but letting her lead this battle. The clerk returned quickly. "Mr. Whitmore will see you now." Whitmore's office reflected his self-importance. Heavy furniture, hunting trophies, a massive desk positioned to intimidate visitors. The banker himself stood by the window, feigning calm though his knuckles showed white where he gripped a walking stick. "Mrs. Callahan," he said stiffly, "I understand there was some trouble at your property." "Trouble?" Elizabeth's laugh held no humor. 6 armed men attempted to burn us out. Your foreman was identified among them. Whitmore shrugged. If Peterson was there, he acted without my knowledge. I'll look into the matter naturally. 6 witnesses say otherwise, Shadow Horse said quietly. Whitmore's gaze flickered to him with undisguised contempt. The word of an Indian and some ranch hands against a respected businessman? Please. Elizabeth stepped forward, placing Thomas's journal on the desk. You altered our loan agreement, changed the terms after Thomas died. A serious accusation, Whitmore said, though a flush spread across his jowls. One you cannot prove. Thomas kept copies of everything, Elizabeth countered, extracting papers from the journal, including the original loan document with the true terms. 5 years of quarterly payments, no acceleration clause. Whitmore's face hardened. Even if that were true, your property has clearly fallen into disrepair. The bank has every right to send armed men in the night? Elizabeth interrupted. The sheriff is questioning your foreman as we speak. How long before he confesses who gave the orders? For the first time, uncertainty flickered in Whitmore's eyes. He glanced toward the door, calculating escape routes. Shadow Horse moved subtly to block the exit. Sit down, he suggested. Whitmore sank into his chair, bravado crumbling. What do you want? The deed to my ranch, Elizabeth said. Free and clear. Impossible. The outstanding loan is null, given your forgery and attempted murder, Elizabeth finished. A fair trade for our silence. You're blackmailing me, Whitmore sputtered. Justice, Shadow Horse corrected. Elizabeth placed a blank sheet of paper before the banker. Write it. Now. Transfer of deed. All water rights included. Loan satisfied in full. Whitmore's pen hovered over the paper. And if I refuse? The door opened as if on cue, admitting the sheriff. He surveyed the scene with experienced eyes. Thought I might find you here, Mrs. Callahan, he said. Peterson's talking. Says Whitmore ordered the whole thing. The sabotage, the threats, last night's attack. Whitmore's face drained of color. That's a lie. I never specifically said. So you did give some orders, the sheriff noted. Interesting. The banker's shoulders slumped in defeat. He began writing, each word seemingly painful. You've won nothing, he muttered as he signed with a vicious flourish. That cursed land will ruin you as it did your husband. Elizabeth took the deed, examining it carefully before passing it to the sheriff. Witness this, please. As the sheriff added his signature, Elizabeth looked down at Whitmore with quiet dignity. The land isn't cursed, Mr. Whitmore. It simply requires love and respect. Something you wouldn't understand. Outside, townspeople had gathered, drawn by rumors of confrontation. Elizabeth emerged with Shadow Horse beside her, deed clutched firmly in hand. She paused on the bank steps, facing the crowd directly. Some of you believed the Callahan ranch was cursed, she said, voice clear in the hushed street. Others spread rumors about me, about my husband's death, about the men who worked for me. Her gaze swept the onlookers. The only curse was greed and lies, Mr. Whitmore's greed, and all of your willingness to believe the worst. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Peterson stepped forward from her dry goods store. What happens now, Elizabeth? She asked, using her given name for the first time in years. Elizabeth's hand found Shadow Horse's, fingers interlacing openly. Now we build something new. The gesture wasn't lost on the townspeople. Expressions ranged from shock to disapproval to, from a few, something like respect. As they mounted their horses to return home, Shadow Horse asked quietly, Regrets? Elizabeth looked back at the town, then forward to the mountains beyond, where their ranch lay waiting. Not one, she replied 1 year later. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the Callahan ranch as Shadow Horse put the finishing touches on his latest project. The hand-carved cradle, fashioned from cottonwood gathered along the creek, represented weeks of evening work, each curve shaped with care, each joint fitted with precision, the entire piece sanded smooth as silk. From the porch, Elizabeth watched him work, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly. At 6 months along, her pregnancy had brought a glow to her face and a fullness to her figure that both of them treasured. "It's beautiful," she called as he carried the cradle toward the house. "Too fine for a simple ranch baby." Shadow Horse set the cradle on the porch beside her rocking chair. "No such thing as simple baby," he replied, his hand joining hers over the life growing within. The ranch had transformed in the year since their confrontation with Whitmore. Fields that had lain fallow now produced abundant crops. The barn stood straight and solid, its red paint renewed. Cattle and horses grazed contentedly in pastures enclosed by sturdy fencing. Most striking was the west pasture. No longer a place of dread, it had been converted to a memorial garden. Wildflowers surrounded the graves, which were now marked with proper headstones and tended with regular care. Elizabeth visited still, but the visits had evolved from painful obligations to peaceful moments of remembrance. Their wedding had been small but meaningful, combining Elizabeth's Christian traditions with Apache ceremonial elements. The local minister had initially refused to perform the ceremony, but Mrs. Peterson had surprisingly intervened, shaming him with scripture about all being equal in God's eyes. In the end, they were married in the garden at sunset, witnessed by the few townspeople brave enough to defy convention and the mountains that had stood silent witness to all that had come before. Not everyone accepted their union. Some families still crossed the street when they came to town together. Others refused to do business with them. But these reactions mattered less with each passing day. "Dr. Williams is coming tomorrow," Elizabeth said as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "He wants to see how the clinic is progressing." The conversion of the old bunkhouse into a small medical clinic had been Elizabeth's idea, a way to honor Thomas's memory while serving the isolated ranching families who had no access to medical care. With her knowledge of basic medicine and herbs, supplemented by the young doctor's monthly visits from Carson City, the clinic had already saved 2 lives and delivered 3 babies. "Good man," Shadow Horse observed. Dr. Williams had been one of the first to treat him with respect, showing genuine interest in Apache healing practices and incorporating some into his own treatments. Elizabeth's fingers traced the intricate carvings on the cradle, protective symbols that blended Apache traditions with the Christian motifs her own father had carved on her childhood bed. "What if the town never fully accepts us?" she asked, voicing a concern that occasionally still troubled her. "Or our child?" Shadow Horse considered before answering. "Some never will," he acknowledged. "But child will know love here, will know truth of both worlds." His hand covered hers. "Stronger for it." Elizabeth smiled, the worry fading from her eyes. "Like its father." As darkness settled, they moved inside to the warmth of the kitchen. The house had changed too, lighter, airier, with windows that once had been permanently shuttered now open to sunlight and fresh air. Thomas's medical journals shared shelf space with Shadow Horse's carved figures and Elizabeth's collection of pressed wildflowers. Different worlds coexisting in harmony. After supper, they walked to the edge of the property as had become their custom, watching the first stars appear above the mountains. In the distance, a coyote called, its cry echoed by others across the valley. "I never thought I'd feel this again," Elizabeth said softly. "What?" "Hope." She leaned against his solid strength. "After James died, after Thomas, I thought that part of me was gone forever." Shadow Horse's arm encircled her shoulders, drawing her closer. "Not gone, just waiting." They stood together as full darkness enveloped the land, the ranch buildings behind them glowing with lamplight that spilled from uncovered windows. No more fear of the night. No more dread of what might lurk in shadows. The gentle movement within Elizabeth's belly brought a smile to both their faces as they felt it together. A promise of future, of continuity, of new stories waiting to be written. When they returned to the house, Shadow Horse paused on the porch, looking back at the ranch spread before him, at the land that had rejected so many but had ultimately accepted him, at the place where he had arrived a solitary figure burdened by past sins and would soon be the father of a child with claims to two rich heritages. Elizabeth's hand slipped into his. "Coming inside?" "Yes," he said, turning toward the woman who had shown him how to love again, toward the home they had created together from broken pieces of separate lives. The rocking chair on the porch moved gently in the evening breeze as they closed the door behind them. No longer empty, no longer waiting.